Hello tanks and tankettes, and welcome to the first supporter spotlight of 2019. This is going to be a mixed video, so we're going to have tanks and warships for you. And as ever, we're going to kick off with the tanks. This is Katia, who, if you have watched this strand for a while, you will know that she likes her slow British tank destroyers, in particular the AT-15A. But this time round, she is in the AT-8. One of the reasons I chose this one is that although it's a little bit derpy, I hope she forgives me for saying so, but you will see what I mean. You don't often see this machine represented on YouTube, and in fact you just don't often see it in game either. It's not particularly popular, although I think it is better than it used to be. It used to be one of the weakest of the Nuffield line, the casement tank destroyers, because that second gun it's got sticking out the front, the what is it, like a 20mm Polston, something along those lines, that armour around that second gun used to be considerably weaker. So not only did you have the honking great big commander's hatch for everybody to shoot at, but if people knew what they were doing, they could just shoot at one side of your frontal armour and have no difficulty penning it whatsoever. Nowadays, however, the entire frontal armour of the casemate anyway is uniform, so although you do still have to worry about the honking great big commander's hatch, if you get a game like this where you're top tier, it's rather effective. And none of these people do seem to be particularly aiming for her weak spot. So although her shooting is maybe not necessarily great, in fact, it does maybe lead me to wonder if she isn't playing this on a laptop or something. This is a rare instance where the armour seems to be holding up really, really well. She's already up to over 2,000 damage blocked. She's also done over 1,000. You know, the gun was always pretty good. Tier 6 is the sweet spot for the 17-pounder gun. Although, of course, these days you can get that gun with a turret on a more mobile machine. And I don't think there are really any particular advantages this has over the Achilles other than that thicker frontal armour. So she's just ploughed forwards, bounced a bunch of stuff, none of those people apparently knew where to hit her weak spot, and now she's been able to flank this Churchill 7. And it's at this stage that the rather extreme derp occurs. Instead of just holding position by that wreck, taking out the FT, she instead goes forwards enough that the FT is suddenly a problem, and that's giving the Churchill all kinds of shots into her side and rear armour. Fortunately, however, it doesn't really matter in the scheme of things. She gets away with it because they are winning pretty handily, pretty strongly at this point anyway. So her teammates took out that tank destroyer, and she's now managed to get herself back in front of the Churchill, which isn't the most fast, isn't the speediest heavy tank anyway, so she's now just pummeling it to death. I've no idea where they were hitting her over and over again in the front, but wherever it was not even beginning to pen, so even more bonus bounced damage. So yeah, that was a bit derpy. It wasn't an especially well judged move, but it did work out in the end, and she walked away from that with not only the ace, not only a high caliber, but the steel wall and a Spartan medal as well. 2,217 damage done, 1,200 base XP, and what was it, over 3,000 bounced damage by the end? You're probably not going to get that in anything other than a top tier game, and it especially helps if apparently nobody knows where to aim for your frontal weak spots. There we go, 3.2k damage bounced. So that's not unimpressive. But as I say, yeah, a little bit derpy. Don't do that at home, kids. Next, we're jumping all the way up to the top of the other line, or very near the top of the other line. This is Runaway Brave Sir Robin playing on the Asia server. And he's actually platooned up with another familiar name, Flying Elite there in the 263. But this game really is all about Brave Sir Robin in the FV 4004 Conway. And this is a tank that, as I mentioned in my start of the tanks video where I showed off some of my own games, this is a tank I've been grinding for a very long time. Indeed, a tank I have only just unlocked in like the last week and a half, something like that. I'm still using the stock gun, but it's not bad. It doesn't have the mobility of the Charioteer. It actually has, I think, a bit less gun depression than the Charioteer, but once you get that big gun, well, it becomes a tank destroyer with a turret and a big gun and a reasonable mobility. So all in all, it's a pretty nice package. It still doesn't have any armour to speak of, though. You really are just relying on not getting hit, and if you do get hit, then yeah, it's just gonna eat into your hit points. So it's not an ideal frontline machine, and he's definitely not using it as any kind of frontline machine, at least not for now. Flying Elite, on the other hand, in the much more heavily armoured 263, is absolutely getting in the enemy tanks' faces here on Mountain Pass. It's a bit limiting for the time being, though. He doesn't have much to shoot at unless some enemies get spotted or come out into the open, but some are getting spotted from time to time, and there we go, rolls high enough to finish off that bat chat, so that's a useful kill at a very dangerous tier 10 medium tank. And if you can line up for a shot on the Scorpion as well, well, that would also be a nasty machine, even though it's a tier, well, it's not a tier 10 game, is it? It's a tier 9 game, so it'll be the tier 9 bat chat. Yes, it is the tier 9 bat chat. Yeah, if you can take out the Scorpion, that is a dangerous gun. So the third member of the division, Burning Seraph, there goes for the spot and gets the Scorpion killed. Also reacquires that Conway, so we know exactly where they are. But unless he tries to get down there himself, he's probably not going to get too many more shots from this position. And as I said, this really doesn't have the gun depression for that. I'm going by memory here. I think it's the worse gun depression than the Charioteer, but it's always dangerous when I say things like that because I might just be misremembering. So a bit of a bonus shot there. That AMX-30 pulls out a little bit too far and there's some extra damage. It does get him spotted though, and so he has to get out of the line of fire of that Pershing. That brings him right into the perfect shot to finish off that Alpine Tiger though, that's the WZ-111 with the special skin, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. And it was a high enough roll and an over average roll to, again, just one-shot them, which is quite nice. They look like they are doing alright on this corner, and I think a big part of that is, well, Flying Elite is here and will have done a reasonable amount of damage in the process. But the Type 4 Heavy, the main top tier dangerous tank, is actually on the other side. There was the 252 here, but they've taken that out, so it really is just the last couple of enemy tanks. Still, Runaway has to be, I don't think I've ever called him that before. Runaway Brave Sir Robin, or just Sir Robin, that makes more sense. He's still being quite cautious, he's still doing what he can to conserve his hit points, because there's a good chance that he's going to need them if it comes to getting any closer to enemy tanks. This isn't really a map where you can sit and camp in bushes in many places at all. And the enemy team, I mean, it's not like this is a straight ruffle stop. They are slightly ahead, but yeah. Now that shot, I had to go and look up the armour model for that shot. He not only took a hit from the Conway, but artillery at the same time, so that was just over half of his health gone in one go. The enemy Conway, on the other hand, yeah, there is one strip of armour on the mantlet underneath the gun where it could bounce a shell from another Conway. And that's just the point on the front of the tank where Sir Robin managed to hit. Pretty much anywhere else on the front of the tank, on the side of the tank, that would have been a pen. He would have at least killed the Conway. He still would have taken the damage, but as it was Flying Elite that swooped in and took the kill, and he took half of his health vanishing for really no gain whatsoever. So that was a bit awkward. Flying Elite is at this point also extremely low health. The Conqueror is the only one here with any particular amount of hit points left, and as you can see, they're trying to get them to go forwards, but they are being really very cautious. On the other flank, the Type 4 Heavy and whatever else that is, an ISU, I think, they have not pushed at all, so they've just sat in that position. The type is almost a non-factor in this game. They're blocking up the glacier, but they're not really doing anything other than that. While they're waiting for this Conqueror to move up, Flying Elite got spotted and the enemy Charioteer took them out, so that's unfortunate because they've just lost one of the better players on the game. And then Artillery proves that they're still aiming at this spot, and even though it's only a splash, it's still another 200 hit points that he can ill afford to lose. And this is what it's like with most fragile tank destroyers. When it goes wrong very, very quickly. So they are slowly closing the noose around this enemy team, but this is by no means an assured win just yet, because a lot of them are starting to really run down on health. And at least on this side of the map, a lot of these tanks are able to support each other. They've got supporting lines of fire. So the Conqueror is now a one-shot themselves. We at least know where the Charioteer is, and Sir Robin is going to have to take the risk if he wants to get any kind of shot here. So if he is able to get some shots on the Lorraine, well, that might help out Seraph a fair bit. In fact, there we go. The efforts of his allies, and Seraph himself included, actually take the Lorraine down to very low health. But the Lorraine then just goes for Seraph, although he does fortunately get them before they can get him. Sir Robin, meanwhile, is very definitely spotted, and he has to be careful here, because if somebody shoots him from that shelf at the bit next to the bit next to the base, and my words have failed me as they so frequently do, but if someone shot him from there, that could have been the end. But fortunately for him, they're not being quite that aggressive. They are, however, paying attention enough to kill Seraph as he tries to get up onto the higher ground from that valley area. And although they do seem to be doing alright here, somebody is going to have to make the sacrifice. This is going to be a rather close end. If they all just go in one by one and don't actually make the best of the tanks that are inevitably going to die to do some damage as they're going in, then yeah, it's not going to go well. I used a couple of Hesh shells there. Didn't, I think, get full pens with any of those, and in fact shot into the tracks of the ISU, but the splash was enough to kill them off. That just leaves Artillery and the Rheinmetall, who have just killed the T-34, so it's now 2 versus 1, and he is easily a kill for that Rheinmetall, who has the 15cm gun. The Arty, meanwhile, is trying to make a run for it, and Sir Robin, rather than let them live, takes the risky option of pulling the trigger. And it's a risky option because this Rheinmetall knows he's going to be reloading and might have enough time to get off a shot. Fortunately for Sir Robin, though, he reloads just in time to fire and track the Rheinmetall. And then even more fortunately, the Rheinmetall was firing HE. And it's enough to almost kill him, but not quite. So that ended on a very close note, and it was in fact his second gun mark on top of everything else. But yeah, if that HE shell had rolled a little higher, done a little more damage, that would have been the game right there. It would have been Artillery versus that Rheinmetall, although it still could have gone in their favour, but it would be an even more RNG ending at that stage. But as it was, it didn't quite come to that, and so Robin lived to tell another tale and ran away bravely to live another day. So there we go, a decent all-round game, and a well-deserved ace, really. It's perhaps worth noting from the team screen that Flying Elite and Seraph both did pretty well for themselves as well. Flying Elite was in second place and Seraph in fourth. Not quite a podium finish, but not far off. Finally, we come to Warships and Andy CX in HMS Nelson with some very good matchmaking. And it's even better when you realise that none of the enemy battleships can overmatch his armour. they all have 14-inch guns or smaller. And that's important because 15-inch guns can overmatch the bow and stern of Nelson, as they can with all the other Tier 7 battleships. But that's particularly relevant for the Nelson because it has quite an exposed citadel, especially compared to a lot of the other British battleships. So although it does get the super heal that you find at Tier 9 and 10, it feels far more deserving of it than the Lion and the Conqueror do, because it takes punishment far more easily than they do. It also, of course, still has the monster HE shells that you find on a lot of the other British battleships. Not all of them, but quite a lot of them. And so if you do come across a Nelson, it's probably going to be firing lots of HE. But that's not something you'll see Andy doing. He's going to be taking full advantage of the power of these 16-inch AP shells. And they are quite good. They're not great penetration for being 16-inch AP shells, but it's still good enough, especially when you have matchmaking like this. I'll tell you now though, we're back to a bit of derp with this one. Not quite as derpy as Katia's misjudged play in that first 88 game, but it's not going to be 100% error free. It will still be quite a close game though. So it's a standard game on Trident, and although he's top tier, the fact it's a standard game alone does make things a little more awkward. It's also going to be awkward in that pretty much all the battleships barring the Britannia are on this side of the cap, and the other side is looking a little weak perhaps. Although so far there's a fairly even spread of enemy ships as well, so there's nothing too much to worry about. It is maybe going to make Andy's job of angling a bit awkward, however, because, as I've said, he can't be overmatched from the front or rear, but he can still eat huge amounts of damage if he's giving too much broadside. And so maybe he'd have been better off taking a slower course, just angling his front towards the enemy and using his front two guns. And instead he's trying to use his mobility a bit more, and that's fine, but it is opening him up to a lot more enemy fire. He's also discovered that there's a Gajimada very close on this flank. The team's destroyers are nowhere near. Well, actually, there's two of them that are relatively close, but they've left this flank entirely open, and so this Gajimada's been able to sneak up, and that's not good news for Andy. What's also not good news is he's not quite noticed that there's an island that's going to be in front of him, and he's actually he's having a bit of a misplay moment here. He's not doing the right thing in terms of avoiding torps when you know there is a destroyer nearby. Quite apart from the fact he's having to avoid running aground, he's having to really slow down, and that just makes life much easier for this Madder if they're going to drop torps on him. They haven't yet, but it does feel a little inevitable that they will do. He'd have been much better basically keeping his nose in towards them and maybe even killing his speed or turning away in the other direction. I mean, the Leon, you can see they're angling, they're actually avoiding well, all of the first wave and all the second wave. Andy, on the other hand, yeah, he's going to avoid the second wave, but those two hits hurt. And because torp damage counts as heavy damage, well, despite the super heal, he's now really in trouble. There's very little health he can get back. He can get up to about half hit points. Compared to how much he could heal before he took the torpedoes, yeah, that's really not good. He's put himself in a bad position health-wise. So I think he had a little moment of panic maybe, and then the island was there, and if he'd only kept a bit more bow in towards this Madder, maybe manoeuvred round to the south instead of really slowing down and giving so much broadside. I mean, you could almost argue the Madder made the misplay there with only hitting 2, given how easy Andy made it for them. Although, once the Bartan died, they didn't have anybody to spot for themselves, and they just stuck around in the smoke even though they were blind. So the Madder definitely misplayed as well, but Andy still came out of that considerably less well off than he started. While this has all been going on, the enemy team have been basically pulling back from this flank and pushing round more in a kind of a crescent from the west flank, and they're now within spitting dimage. I don't even know what words my brain was trying to form there. Spitting distance of the cap, but somehow image came into it. There was the famous puppet-based satire show on the BBC in the UK in the back in the 80s called Spitting Image, but that has nothing to do, why would you, that has nothing to do with anything, brain. Why would you throw that word at me? And then I couldn't even say one or the other. No, I had to try and say both at the same time. Spitting dimage. There you go. What the heck, brain? What the heck? So, yeah, it's not looking good, is what I was trying to vaguely get at. And he can't even point his ship fully towards the enemies now pressing from the west, because there's still a KGV to the south that he's going to be giving a broadside to. So this is not great. Although I think he could still be angled better than this. I think once again he's misplaying it a bit in terms of angling. To be fair, just the fact it's a standard game does make it more awkward in terms of just placing your ship overall. But I don't think Andy is helping himself much here. He's done some decent damage so far though, up to nearly 60k already, and if he can stay alive long enough, he might be able to make a difference in this, because he is top tier. But the fact that he's getting rather low health, the fact that he's a top tier battleship, it means he's attracting a fair bit of attention at times. Although he's not being focused unduly hard, there are still enough of them around that the enemy team is spreading their fire a bit. But compared to, say, that Leon that's next to him, he's obviously a much more tempting target just because he is lower health. They're not going down without a fight though. The points are against them, but we've still got almost 11 minutes left on the clock, and the enemy team has taken some casualties themselves. They're down by more than half their players at this point. In fact, they're only, what, one ship apart now? So although it's not looking great, it's not insurmountable. But Andy has to play a little bit better than he's played so far. And don't worry, there will be a point to this replay. I'm not just, you know, picking on Andy and saying, here's this derpy replay he sent me, let's all point and laugh. You've seen more than enough of my own derpy replays to know that I'm not one to be able to judge, really. And it's one of these things where you can watch a replay and it's a lot easier in retrospect to watch what somebody's been doing and pick out the mistakes, but it's not always that easy when you're actually playing a game. And sometimes even very, very good players make mistakes that in retrospect just make them slap their heads and go, why did I do that? So even the best players aren't immune to that sort of thing. So this is a lot of broadside to be showing a Leon and a Congo. An awful lot of broadsides. Honestly, I think he could have... The main threats are the enemy battleships. He could have pointed his nose kind of to the southwest corner, and I think he would have been fine. And instead he's come all the way around, and yes, he gets to keep all his guns firing, but he's rapidly running out of health. This is absolutely not going to be a viable position forever. Interestingly though, he hasn't had a lot of HE fired at him. There haven't been many attempts to burn him down by the enemy ships. Leons, you do not infrequently see firing lots of HE. And I'm not entirely sure why, although, I mean, if you're down-tiered and you're facing somebody that's heavily angled, then yes, having a lot of HE shells to throw at them can be useful. But even top-tier, you'll see people being lazy and firing a lot of HE shells. In fact, where was it I saw somebody commenting that Wargaming is... I think it might have even been Andy. This might have been something on my own, my Patreon Discord, where he and somebody else was having a little chat about, I can't even remember, something Warships related, and I think it might have been Andy that said that they've basically made a rod for their own backs in terms of the British battleships, as we're seeing now, firing a lot of HE. Well, not that we're seeing Andy firing HE, that's not the point of this replay, but just generally British battleship players you see firing a lot of HE. And then that's translated over to people doing the same thing in other battleships, and it's not necessarily good for the game, even though there is a time and a place for it. I mean, if you're only ever 100% firing AP shells, you know, equally you might argue that's doing it wrong, that there are times and places when you could use HE. Perhaps there are some salvos that Andy could have fired of HE that would have served him better than AP in this game. I don't know, but if you're just firing all HE, then yes, you're not helping yourself necessarily. So with the Gneisenau running away to the south, the Emerald having somehow survived and making a dash for the enemy cap, and the entire remaining portion of the enemy team that's still alive now around their cap, this leaves Andy in a rather unenviable position. He does take out the biggest threat in terms of capping, the Mars. The Mars was absolutely, and again, a misplaying enemy destroyer. They could have just stealthed up, gotten in the cap, and Andy would not have been able to reset them unless they revealed themselves. But instead, they ploughed through the cap and were firing at Andy with AP shells, of all things. So that was probably the best chance the enemy team had to cap, because all that's left now is battleships. And Andy can definitely see them, he can definitely keep resetting them, as long as he's alive. And in fact, he set that Congo up, who was broadside, because that seems to be a theme of this replay, is don't sit broadside in a battleship against other battleships. In fact, just generally, even if you're broadside against cruisers, that could be very bad for your health. But it meant that Congo died from high health, and then he's been able to take out the low health KGV, and now all that's left is this Leon, and suddenly it's a 1 versus 1. And the Leon is giving him still broadside, but he's not going to get as lucky as he did with the Congo, considering that the Leon isn't angling all that well, although they're starting to a bit more now. That doesn't matter so much though, as long as he can keep getting resets. And as long as the Emerald is sensible and just sits in the cap. And you might be thinking, why wouldn't they under these circumstances? But, I mean, sometimes players do completely counterproductive things that make you wonder why on earth they did them. So a couple more resets and they've got this in the bag. And this is a situation where the Leon maybe should have been firing HE, you know, having gone on a rather rambling discussion of Battleship HE earlier. This would have been a correct situation for the Leon to fire HE shells. It would have killed Andy quicker. As it is, it gets a fire set by a secondary, and although he's really running low on health, it's not till Andy starts bringing his third turret around, which was maybe a bit of a questionable decision, that he is able to finally finish him off. But crucially, Andy had gotten all the resets he needed, so even though he died, even though they are behind on points, there is enough time for this Emerald to now cap. So, despite this being a somewhat derpy game on Andy's part, he absolutely did the right thing towards the end of it, and although it involved the sacrifice of his ship, it ensured that they won. Because there was no way this Emerald was going to win against a Leon on their own. So the Emerald, of course, we also have to give credit for doing the right thing, getting to the enemy cap and then staying there, not trying to charge down an enemy Leon. They weren't that silly. But if Andy hadn't been getting the resets, then this would, of course, have been a defeat. It was also a pretty decent damage game. It was a bit derpy, but 133k, that's not nothing. And 3 kills to go along with it. So, yeah, that was a bit of an interesting one. Definitely a far from flawless game, but it was a very close ending, and it was a victory as a direct result of what Andy was doing and getting those resets. It didn't half hurt, though, that the enemy team at various points was derping as well, especially that Mars. That Mars could have won the game for them so easily, and instead made themselves an easy victim for Andy's guns. So that's it for this video, which, come to think of it, had an all-British theme, which wasn't even particularly intentional, but there we go. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you did, you can do all the usual things down underneath it. And of course, as always, stay tuned for more.